The dry wind swept across the plains of Wyoming, carrying with it the scent of dust, sage, and the faint whistle of a train cutting through the wilderness. And there, standing in his weathered boots, with his hat pulled low to shade his eyes, was a cowboy named Jacob Callahan, a man who had lived most of his 35 years alone with nothing but the wide-open land, cattle to tend, and a dog-eared Bible his mother had left him when she passed. And though he was rugged, strong, and feared by men who tried to cross him, inside he carried an emptiness that gnawed at him like the howl of coyotes at night. He had decided, after years of solitude, that it was time to send for a mail-order bride, for he was tired of coming home to an empty cabin and talking to no one but his horse. And so he wrote a letter to an agency in St. Louis, describing the kind of woman he thought would suit his life, a woman of strong build, used to work, plain in her ways, but God-fearing and willing to stand beside him through dust storms, long winters, and the rough life of the frontier. And after months of waiting, the day finally came when the train screeched to a halt at the small, lonely station, the sun dipping low behind the mountains and painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold. And Jacob's heart beat heavy against his chest as he adjusted his hat and waited for the woman he believed would change his life. But when the passengers began to file off, he saw her slender, dressed in a soft blue gown that looked far too fine for ranch life, her dark hair pinned up neatly, though strands danced loose in the wind, her eyes wide with fear yet lit with determination, and at her side a small boy, no older than 6, clutching her hand as if the world depended on it. And Jacob's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat, because this was not what he ordered. Not at all, for he had asked for a strong ranch wife, not a delicate lady with a child, and certainly not someone who looked as though she belonged in parlors and ballrooms, rather than in barns and fields. And as she stepped onto the platform, her gaze met his, and though there was fear in her, there was also something else, something he could not name, something that stirred the long-buried part of him that had been starved of warmth. But pride swelled inside him, and he muttered under his breath, "You're not what I ordered." Words that carried sharpness, words she clearly heard, for her lips tightened and her chin lifted with quiet defiance. And the boy, sensing the tension, clung tighter to her skirt, yet she did not back away. Instead, she stood her ground like a willow, bending, but never breaking in the wind. And Jacob, though unsettled, stepped forward, his boots echoing heavy against the wooden platform, his voice low and rough as gravel when he asked her name. And she answered softly but firmly, "My name is Clara Bennett, and this is my son, Samuel. And we have come because I was told there was a man here who sent for a bride who needed not only a wife, but a family." And Jacob's jaw clenched, because the agency had not mentioned a child, had not mentioned a woman with such city-bred refinement, and the thought of suddenly taking responsibility for a boy nearly made him turn away. But something in Clara's voice, something in the way she straightened her back and refused to look ashamed, made him pause, and the silence stretched between them like a rope, pulled taut, until finally he exhaled slow, running a hand over his jaw, muttering again, "You're not what I ordered." But instead of leaving her standing in the dust, he reached out and took her hand, rough calluses against soft skin. And though she stiffened, he did not let go, because deep down Jacob Callahan knew that life had a way of sending not what a man wanted, but what he truly needed. And as the train pulled away, leaving only the 3 of them on the platform, with the wind whistling through the beams, Jacob realized this meeting was no accident, no mistake of fate, but the beginning of a story he could not yet understand, a story where love would come not in the form of what he ordered, but in the form of what he was destined to fight for, cherish, and protect. And so, with the boy's wide eyes watching him and Clara's trembling breath caught between pride and fear, Jacob led them away from the station, unaware of the trials, dangers, and revelations that awaited, yet certain of one thing: he had taken her hand. And from this day forward, come hell or high water, he was not about to let it go. The first weeks on Jacob Callahan's ranch were harder than Clara Bennett had ever imagined, for the cabin was small, the nights bitterly cold despite the summer heat of the day, and the work endless. And though Jacob had not turned her and Samuel away, his silence weighed heavy on her heart, because though his hand had claimed hers at the train station, his eyes often looked past her as if still reckoning with the fact that she was not the bride he had ordered. And yet Clara refused to falter, for she had crossed too many miles, endured too many whispers of shame after being widowed young, to allow herself to break now. And so she rose before dawn each day, cooking simple meals, sweeping dust from floors that seemed to invite it back within hours, and helping Samuel learn the ways of the prairie, while Jacob watched with quiet curiosity, never speaking much but noticing everything. The way she coaxed Samuel to feed the chickens, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, the way her eyes lingered on him, not with resentment, but with something he dared not name. And though he had sworn to himself she was not the woman he wanted, every night when he saw her tucking Samuel into bed with a tenderness that stirred memories of his own mother, Jacob's heart softened like snow melting under a spring sun. Yet trouble on the frontier was never far, for the land was wild and full of men who lived by no law but their own. And one evening, as the horizon burned red, riders came, 3 of them, rough men from a nearby gang that had long harassed ranchers for money and cattle. And Jacob stood at the doorway, revolver on his hip, shielding Clara and Samuel behind him as the men sneered and demanded supplies. And though fear gripped Clara's chest like a vice, she saw in that moment what kind of man Jacob truly was. For he did not yield, did not bow his head, but stared the men down with steel in his gaze, until they spat in the dirt and rode off, vowing to return. And when the dust settled, Clara realized that though Jacob might not have chosen her, he would risk his life to protect her and her boy. And that stirred something inside her, something stronger than fear. In the days that followed, Jacob began to let his guard slip, teaching Samuel to ride a pony, showing Clara how to mend fences, and once, when she burned her hand on the stove, he took her wrist gently in his rough hands and wrapped it with a cloth, his touch lingering longer than it should, his eyes betraying a softness that words could not carry. And Clara felt her heart tremble because she knew then that she was falling in love with the man who once said she was not what he ordered. Still, doubt lingered, for Jacob carried scars not of the flesh but of the soul, scars from years of loneliness, betrayal, and hardship. And one night, by the fire, he finally confessed, his voice low and unsteady, that he had once loved a woman who had chosen wealth over him, leaving him with nothing but bitterness. And that was why he had asked for a plain bride, who would not remind him of dreams too sweet to last. And Clara listened with tears in her eyes, realizing that fate had brought her here not to be what he wanted, but to be what he needed. And with trembling courage she took his hand and whispered, "Maybe God didn't give you what you ordered because he wanted to give you what would heal you." And Jacob, for the first time in years, let himself believe in grace. But just as their hearts began to entwine, danger returned, for the gang of riders came again, this time under the cover of night, setting fire to the barn and shouting threats. And Jacob fought them with every ounce of grit in his body, Clara clutching Samuel inside the cabin as gunfire echoed against the mountains. And when the smoke cleared and the men fled, one bullet had grazed Jacob's side, blood staining his shirt, and Clara ran to him, cradling him against her as tears fell hot upon his chest, whispering prayers that he would not leave her, not now, not after she had found the courage to love again. And in that desperate moment Jacob realized he could not deny the truth any longer, that she was not what he ordered, but she was everything he wanted, everything he needed, everything he had been waiting for. And with a voice weak but steady he whispered, "Marry me, Clara, marry me, not because I sent for you, but because I can't live without you." And her tears turned to trembling laughter as she kissed his brow and promised she would. And the days that followed were filled not with despair, but with hope, as Jacob healed slowly, and together they rebuilt the barn, neighbors coming to help after hearing of the attack. And word spread of the woman with quiet strength, who had tamed the loneliest cowboy in Wyoming. And so, on a golden morning with the mountains standing like silent witnesses, Jacob and Clara stood together under the open sky, Samuel holding both their hands, as a traveling preacher pronounced them husband and wife. And when Jacob kissed her, it was not with hesitation, but with the fire of a man who had finally found home. And Clara knew in her soul that though she had not been what he ordered, she had been what God destined. And Samuel, looking up at the man who now called him son, smiled with a joy that reached the heavens. And as the wind carried their laughter across the plains, a new family was born, bound not by order or chance, but by love that had conquered loneliness, fear, and fire, proving that sometimes the best stories are written not by what we demand, but by what we are given. Married life on the frontier was nothing like the polished tales Clara had once read in tattered books back east. Reality was a mixture of hardship and sweetness, like honey stirred into bitter coffee, and every day tested the strength of their union. For the land was wild and unyielding, the cattle restless, the weather unpredictable, and yet within those challenges something beautiful grew, a bond forged not in luxury or ease, but in the sweat of shared labor and the quiet solace of knowing that neither was alone anymore. Each morning Clara rose with the dawn, her dress dusted by the flour of biscuits baking, Samuel's laughter filling the cabin as Jacob ruffled his hair before leading him out to feed the horses. And though Jacob had always been a solitary man, he found himself smiling more, speaking softer, lingering longer at the table after supper, for Clara's presence filled the empty spaces of his soul like sunlight, flooding a dark room. And Samuel, once shy and uncertain, began to bloom under Jacob's guidance, learning to ride, to rope, and to pray at night beside his mother and new father, his small voice whispering thanks for a home he once feared he would never know. Yet peace was never long-lived on the plains, for whispers of unrest spread from ranch to ranch, tales of rustlers growing bolder, of a gang determined to seize land and drive out families. And Jacob, though hardened by years of facing down threats, now carried new fear not for himself, but for Clara and Samuel. And he wrestled with the weight of responsibility, knowing that protecting them meant more than drawing his gun. It meant building a life so strong that no storm could tear it apart. Clara, too, fought battles of her own, for though Jacob loved her fiercely, she sometimes still heard the echo of his first words, "You're not what I ordered," haunting her in moments of doubt. And she would stare into the mirror, seeing not the rugged ranch wife Jacob had asked for, but the woman fate had sent instead, wondering if she was enough, until Jacob, sensing her unspoken fears, would take her into his arms after long days and whisper against her hair, "You may not have been what I thought I wanted, Clara, but you're more than I ever dreamed I needed." And those words steadied her heart like a prayer answered in the wilderness. Then came the autumn, when the air sharpened with the promise of early snow, and trouble finally struck in full force. For the same gang that had once scarred their lives returned with vengeance, riding hard at night with torches blazing, determined to seize the Callahan ranch as their own. And Jacob, forewarned by neighbors, gathered his courage and prepared. But this time Clara refused to be a bystander. She armed herself with resolve, guiding Samuel to safety, standing beside Jacob as the night exploded in chaos gunfire, shouting, the crackle of flames, and though fear clutched her heart, she stood unshaken, her eyes locked on Jacob, ready to fight for the man who had claimed her and the boy who needed her. And together they withstood the attack, Jacob's steady aim and Clara's fierce determination, proving stronger than the cowardice of the raiders, who at last retreated into the darkness, leaving behind smoldering ashes but no victory. In the quiet that followed, as dawn crept across the horizon, Clara cradled Jacob's weary frame, Samuel clinging to them both, and she realized that marriage was not about what was ordered or expected, but about standing shoulder to shoulder when the world tried to break you. And as neighbors arrived to help rebuild, bringing lumber, food, and prayers, Clara felt the bond of community weave around them like a quilt against the cold, reminding her that family was not only the three of them, but all who chose to stand with them. That winter was harsh, snow burying fences and frost etching patterns on the cabin windows. Yet inside their home there was warmth, Jacob teaching Samuel to carve wood by the fire, Clara reading stories aloud, their laughter filling the nights once marked by silence. And in those moments Jacob often stared at Clara, marveling at the mystery of how a woman he had once rejected in words had become the very heartbeat of his life. And he vowed silently that never again would he let her doubt her worth, for she was his miracle in the dust, his answered prayer in unexpected form. And when spring finally broke the grip of winter, painting the plains with wild flowers, Jacob and Clara renewed their vows beneath the open sky, this time not with strangers gathered, but with Samuel between them, neighbors smiling, and the knowledge that love, once unexpected, had become their destiny. And Jacob whispered as he kissed her, "You were not what I ordered. Clara, you were so much more." And Clara, with tears shining like diamonds in the sun, finally let herself believe she had found forever, not in the life she planned, but in the life she was given. And as the wind carried the scent of blossoms across the ranch, their story built on grit, grace, and unshakable love became. But in what we are given when we dare to hold on,